So warm welcome to everyone that has joined so far. This is the first public data science meeting where we are combining the language we love, Clojure, with the very exciting topic of healthcare. My name is João Santiago, or just like I said, Santiago for short. I am a medical doctor currently working as a data scientist in Berlin, Germany, and I'll be moderating the meeting today. Before we start with the actual presentations, I would like to give everyone a couple of guidelines to make the meeting as pleasant as possible for everyone. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. You can post, and please do post any questions at any time in the chat. I will be collecting the questions throughout the meeting, and after each speaker's presentation, I will pick one or two questions to present to the speakers, and then at the end, we will go over the ones that were not selected during the open discussion. The session is recorded, and we will, I think Daniel put this on YouTube later on. So if you don't feel comfortable having your camera on for any reason, for example, you're free to not do that. Although I would invite everyone to have the camera on during the session so that the speakers are not speaking into the cold and empty Zoom avatars. If during the meeting anyone has any issue, you can always contact me via private chat or Daniel Slutsky here in Zoom, and we will try to figure out how to help you. So tonight, or today, depending on your time zone, we have two speakers. The first one will be Sivaram Arabandi. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Perfect. He's a medical doctor and computer scientist working in the field of biomedical ontologies, helping integrate and transform biomedical and clinical data so that it can be used in cool applications like decision systems and NLP. And hello, Sivaram, you're already online? Hello. And we also have Pier Gherardini. Hope I got that right. He's currently the director of informatics at the Parker Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy, where he focuses on implementation of advanced assay technologies for the analysis of clinical samples and methods to visualize and analyze data. Hello, Pierre. So without further ado, I would give the stage to you, Sivaram, to talk about biomedical ontologies.
Okay, thank you, Santiago. Let me start sharing my screen. Okay, you should be seeing my screen now. I'll try and minimize this.
Yeah, it's perfect.
And start going to presentation mode. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah, perfect.
All right. Thank you, Santiago, and thank you, Daniel, for setting this up. It's a pleasure to be speaking here at the Clojure for Science, Clojure for Data Science group. And today I will be talking about biomedical ontologies, some design patterns and applications. So I'll be going over a little bit of ontology basics because I think from some of the previous conversations, it looked like most people are not familiar with ontologies. So bear with me. Okay, let's start with taking a look at what a clinical case looks like. Here's an example: 60 years old male patient presented with a sudden onset of chest pain, nausea, sweating, and dyspnea, having a past history of mitral valve stenosis. ECG showed ST elevation. There were some labs done, troponin and CKMB. A diagnosis of myocardial infarction was made, and thrombolytic therapy was initiated. Angiography was performed that demonstrated a left anterior descending artery stenosis, more than 90%, and the patient was stented. So this is a kind of a typical note you would see. Now, if you annotate this, or if you classify this into certain kinds of things, here we have different kinds of data elements like 60 years, male, chest pain, nausea, sweating, dyspnea, mitral valve stenosis and all. Now, if we categorize this a little further, right, this is what they look like. So we have some demographic kind of information like age and gender, some symptoms and signs, lab information, diagnosis, and some management aspects that are there. And these come in different kinds of data types, right? There are some continuous type of data, where, like the values and that have measurement units and some range and things like that, like age, weight, troponin, FEV1, which is the respiratory volume measurement. And then on the other hand, we have some categorical types of values, like sex or diagnosis, medications, etc. Now, Boolean is a special type of categorical, right, where you have like a true or false value for this. And so things like, does the patient have a past history of stroke? Is there a history of coughing, right? You're going to say true or false there. And this, so the scope of all this is that we have a variety of types of different information, right? We're looking at clinical care data, symptom signs, diagnosis, labs, etc. Information from research, registries, studies, clinical trials, etc. Some demographic information and some genomics information. So this presents us with a number of challenges, data challenges, right? The good news is that there's a lot of data available for us. The bad news is that the data is, it's all segmented, it's all fragmented in silos. And in addition, there are, because we are dealing with a number of different data sources, we have structural differences, right? Because of the localized database schemas that are used. And even within that, how well structured is it, right? And you might get some text data as well. So it is an integration challenge for us, for sure. But that's only the beginning, because we then have to, we're also faced with the challenges with the semantics, the meaning of the data. So we'll be having different labels that mean the same thing in different databases. For example, if you take male gender, right, it could be recorded as man, it could be as male, as M, as 1, as 0. So there are different variations in how this can be recorded. Or for that matter, even within a single table, you can come across variables like beta 1 and beta 2, right? And to a clinician, if you're talking about beta 1 and beta 2 blockers, you're thinking about beta 1 selective blocker, beta 2 selective blockers, two different types of medications. But in this case, in one of the examples use cases that we had seen, beta 1 and beta 2 both represented beta blockers without a diuretic. And they actually represented different visits, right? The first visit called beta 1 and the second was called beta 2. So that was a complete curveball for us when we found out that this information from one of the SMEs on the project. So now we have the same label can be used with different meanings. So previously we looked at different labels that could mean the same thing, but now different labels, different meanings can be given to a single label. And for example, the word cold. What does it mean to you? Well, we have at least 3 different meanings, right? One is you could be feeling cold. Or it could be a cold infection, which is a infectious disease. Or it could be chronic obstructive lung disease, which is another synonym for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD also. And then we have things like hypopnea, which is breathing that is very shallow or has an abnormally low respiratory rate, right? So the English definition looks very simple, but when we look at the operational definitions, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine has 2 definitions. There is a recommended definition which says airflow reduction greater than 30% of baseline, lasting for 10 seconds, and a hemoglobin oxygen desaturation of greater than or equal to 4% from baseline. Now, this is one of the definitions. there's an alternate definition. So instead of 30%, they'll say greater than or equal to 50%, again for 10 seconds, but with a hemoglobin desaturation of greater than or equal to 3% instead of 4%. And from one of the projects that I worked on, we know that there are at least 10 other known definitions of this. So the challenges for us when it comes to data can be summarized in this way. We have to deal with some simple as well as complex definitions. We need to deal with overlapping definitions, like we saw with the hypopnea operational definition. We need to deal with data integration challenges, both across applications and across domains. We need to be able to handle query of these different data sources and also make the data suitable for discovery. Now, this is exactly the situation where ontologies have proven to be extremely, extremely useful. So what does an ontology stand for? An ontology is a formal representation of knowledge as a set of concepts within a domain and the relationships between them. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about what is an ontology. I'll give a small demo of what of some of the benefits of using an ontology. And we'll also look at some ontology patterns and uses. Okay, so let's start with what is an ontology. Again, going back to this definition, an ontology is a formal representation of knowledge as a set of concepts within a domain and the relationships between those concepts. So when you're looking at thinking of concepts, concepts are to do with reality and concepts within and domains within that reality. So there are this is a semiotic triangle. Some of you are probably familiar with this, and so this is the real world around us, and we refer to the real world using different terms like city or a capital or diseases and things like that. And for the terms that we are using, it invokes a certain concept, and this is in our mind. This is what we are thinking. And what we think is representing a model of the world. That's what. Now, putting it in a different way, again, we have the world, and as we interpret it, this is there in our thoughts, and we encode it or use symbols or words to refer to it. Now, when we communicate these words to other people, they are thinking about it, and it evokes a certain concept, and that is about the world around us. So this is the semiotic triangle about how we interpret reality, how we talk about reality, and how we conceptualize reality. Now, unfortunately, reality is not so easy to comprehend, right? There's often a lot of things that are lost in translation. So this is a programmer humor, a little bit of programmer humor here, where a customer gave the requirements for a swing, and this is how he explained it. And you can see the transitions as how it was finally it was interpreted. And interestingly enough, the last one shows that, okay, this was actually what the customer wanted, but this is how he explained it, the first one. And here are all the other different interpretations for it. Now, the other aspect of reality is that things change, right? So, and sometimes change is very profound. So for example, before the 16th century, it was common knowledge that the Earth was at the center. And there were pretty complex maps to track how the different planets moved and all that stuff. Copernicus in 16th century presented a different view. And this was the heliocentric or the sun-centric model. And that changed our perception of reality, of how we thought about Earth and other planets. Now, interestingly, Copernicus was very reluctant to present this view because it was so different that he was afraid people would think that he was crazy. But it was a good thing that it came out eventually. Now, going back to how we model information of how we capture the data with regard to the reality around us. So we saw this description: 60 years old male patient presented with sudden onset of chest pain, nausea, sweating, and dyspnea, etc. So this is what a sample information model will look like, right? You're taking the history information, so you've got a number of things that are there, and if you now add the instance data to it, you'll say, okay, chest pain, patient has chest pain, dyspnea, sweating, and nausea, and does not have vomiting, cough, and epigastric pain. So this is a very simple model. It is basically a list of terms and that are there in our database, in the data model. There's no additional meaning that is given around chest pain, epigastric pain, cough, and dyspnea. For the most part, this is how it looks like, right? Now, there may be definitions, but oftentimes it depends upon who is seeing this list and how it is interpreted. Now, an ontology model, on the other hand, is a very rich network of relationships. It's a web of relationships. So if you take the same information or similar information, right? You have what I'm showing here is anatomical aspects and the concepts related to pain. So you have abdomen and chest as two anatomical regions of the body. Epigastrium is a part of the abdomen, and sternum is a part of the chest. Pain is subclassed into abdominal pain and chest pain. So abdominal pain is a type of pain. Chest pain is a type of pain. And now abdominal pain itself is subclassed as epigastric pain, and there are other regions we can put here, but this is the only one that I'm showing here. Similarly, chest pain has ischemic chest pain, pleuritic chest pain, sternal chest pain, depending upon what area and what type of pain it is. Now, epigastric pain is a type of abdominal chest pain and has site the epigastrium, just as abdominal pain is a type of pain and has site abdomen. So you see the part of structure here and the ESO structure here, they go together. Similarly, over here, chest pain has site chest, and then sternal pain is a type of chest pain and has site sternum, and sternum is a part of the chest. So if you connect these two things, you'll see that epigastric pain is a type of, is connected here in the ontology model. Now, the good thing about an ontology model is that this graph representation is actually pretty easily understood, and you can actually tell a story from it. And in addition to just the graph representation, each term has a textual definition to tell us what it means. So now, if you look at the models, there is a spectrum of different kinds of models, from simple to complex. On the left side, some of the simple ones, you can have lists. Like you can throw anything in a list. Control vocabularies are kind of lists which bring together some specific terms which you want to deal with together. Taxonomy is a little bit more structured, in which you have a hierarchical representation of the terms. So in this case, an example of cardiovascular system disease can be is of two types: heart disease and vascular disease. And then again, heart disease can be of different types: mitral stenosis, aortic regurgitation, hypertension, peripheral artery disease, and things. So hypertension and peripheral artery disease are vascular diseases. Mitral stenosis and aortic regurgitation are heart diseases. So you have a taxonomy here which represent a hierarchical structure of diseases. And the most complex of this is the ontological structure, where ontologies represent not just the taxonomic structure, which is in the form of the is a relationship here, but also it has other relationships like here the part of relationship, partonomy for anatomical structures, and other relations like has site. Abdominal pain has site abdomen. Epigastric pain has site epigastrium. things like that. So this is a rich web of relationships that we can use with our information model. Switching gears a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about the place of ontology. So what, how it fits into the bigger picture. So ontology is one of the specifications that is a part of the semantic web stack. So if you see this middle structure in white, you can see that at the bottom is the RDF, which is the foundational layer for the semantic web. And then you have some RDFS, which is the RDF schema language. And then you have OWL, which is more expressive and allows us to specify some rules. And then there is the Sparkle language, which is basically the query language that is used for semantic web. So looking at the first one, right, the foundation one is the resource description framework. Now, the basic fundamental part of the resource description framework is this subject, predicate, object data structure. And these and resources, every resource in semantic web is described using this data structure, subject, predicate, and object data structure. Basically, these are statements, and these triples are basically, they are the fundamental structure of RDF. Let's see how this looks like in practice. So if you take this triple structure, subject, predicate, object, and here is some instance data that can be represented. Say Bob lives in Houston. That is one triple. Bob knows Lisa. That's a different triple. And Lisa likes reading. So here in this case, we are talking about Bob, who live, and there are two relations, lives in and knows. And then there's Houston that is related to the lives in predicate with Bob. And then we're talking about different kinds of concepts here, right? And if you look at it, each one of these entities, the subject and the predicates and all that, they are identified using a uniform resource identifier or a URI. They uniquely identify entities, and when it comes to URLs, these can often be resolved. So, for example, Houston can be represented as dbpedia.org page Houston. And if you go to this website, you can see that it resolves into a description of what Houston is. Now, this more you can that RDF provides. It also provides an ability for us to tell what kind of thing Bob is, or Lisa is, or basically an entity is. So we can represent Bob is of type person, Lisa is of type person, and Houston is of type city. And these also get their own URIs, right? So in this case, we are using the fourth person URI, which is fourth stands for friend of a friend, and that's a model. And in this case, we are using the semantic science ontology to describe what a city is. And Houston is an instance of the city. So what about reading? Well, are we talking about reading as an activity that Lisa likes, or reading the city in UK that she likes? Well, this is what we were talking about ambiguity previously. And I'll talk a little bit more about this later. Just to summarize this part of it, the semantic web has different parts. The RDF is a standard model for data interchange, and triples form the fundamental data structure of the RDF. RDF schema, or RDFS, is the schema language that allows us to describe the instance data that we represent in RDF. So it allows us to define classes and subclass structures, like a person is a subclass of organism, or things like reading is a subclass of activity, and things like that. Web ontology language, or OWL, provides us additional functionality for describing rules and things like that for authoring ontologies. And finally, Sparkle is the query language that we use for querying RDF data. And lastly, serialization formats, RDF data, RDF, RDFS, and web, and all three of them can be serialized into different formats like ntriples, turtle, RDF XML, or even JSON LD. So these are all text formats, and the important thing to remember is, despite these different formats that that an OWL ontology or an RDF data is serialized, they all mean the same thing. So let's go to so I want to give you a little bit of a glimpse into what this actually means in practice. So let's look at a demo of this. So what I did here is I have a small ontology file that I've created for demonstrating some of the different aspects. And so I'm going to show two different things. One is at the class level, and the other is at the instance level. So if you look at things, I've represented at the top level body structures, clinical findings, drug products, geolocations, substance, and a value partition. So the body structure is pretty simple, right? It's a straightforward data structure. So we have abdomen, chest, epigastrium, pleura, and sternum. And if you look at the definition for example, for epigastrium, we say it's a part of abdomen, and sternum is a part of the chest. Chest is what we've defined here. And similarly, in terms of clinical finding, I've defined pain and some subclasses of pain: abdominal pain, chest pain, epigastric pain, ischemic pain, pleuritic pain, and sternal pain. So if you look at sternal pain, you can see the definition has site sternum. It's a subclass of pain and has site sternum. Epigastric pain is a subclass of pain and has site the epigastrium. Now, look what happens when I classify this. So you can see that this is all, it's a simple list here, Now, when I classify this, and I look at the classified hierarchy, you can see that now what was previously a simple list: abdominal pain, chest pain, epigastric pain, and all this. Now you can see that they have, it's become a hierarchy. So epigastric pain is a type of abdominal pain. Ischemic pain, pleuritic pain, and sternal pain are types of chest pain. And that's because we described them we described ischemic pain as site chest, so it became a subclass of chest pain. Now, when we go to the geo ontology, I want to show you, so this was at the class level, and I want to show you at the instance level what happens. So we have here different, I've represented a city and capital city. Capital city is defined as capital of some country or state. Defined a continent, and this is a defined class. So it has, we define the different continents. And so I have some countries, I have some regions, I have some states, and things like that. Now, if you look down here, you can see some of these instances that I have defined, like some cities: London, Hyderabad, Paris, Oslo, and all. So if you go into the definition of this, what I'll do is I'll turn off these inferences, and we'll see here. So London is defined as a city and has a property capital of the United Kingdom. Hyderabad is defined as a city and has a property capital of Telangana. Paris, similarly, capital of France. Now, once I classify this, see what happens. So now, previously what we had London, we only asserted city as it's of type city. Now, because of this association as a capital of United Kingdom, we now can say that it is a capital city and it is a part of Europe. Similarly, you can see for other things, you can see that Hyderabad again has been classified as a capital city, even though we didn't say it is a capital city, or of type capital city. And also it is a part of Asia. These are some of the inferences that we've drawn because we said, if I go to country, you can see here, India has part Hyderabad, has part Andhra Pradesh, and such things. So there are a lot of India as a part of Asia is what I declared, but here are all other things that it has inferred, everything in yellow. So I hope this gives you a little bit of an idea of what you can do, the kind of things you can do with an ontology. Going back to the presentation, I want to look at quickly go through some ontologies in healthcare. So if you look at a proper definition for a disease term, something like acromegaly, this is what it would look like. We represent its clinical findings, like acromegaly is a disease which presents with large jaw, large hands and feet, joint pains, excessive height, and all that. And then it is a type of gigantism, which is a type of hyperpituitarism that has location pituitary, and a part of the pituitary is adenohypophysis, and acromegaly has location adenohypophysis. So you can see that this is a very good graphical representation of what this model of a model of what the disease looks like. We do this by using a number of reference ontologies like SNOMED, which is a very large model covering all of medicine with about 300,000 terms, foundational model of anatomy with about 70,000 terms, gene ontology with about 30,000 terms, and then ontology for general medical science, infectious disease ontology, and so on. Now, reference ontologies they represent domain models. The benefits are that they are carefully curated, consensus-based, and they often have formal definitions, both English and logical. So here is a definition in English of what a disease means. A disease is a disposition to undergo pathological processes that exists in an organism because of one or more disorders in that organism. And you'll see that most of the terms that are there in the ontology will have very clear and consensus-based descriptions like this. The disadvantage is that most of the reference ontologies are at a conceptual level, and they're very large, and they can overwhelm software systems. This is where application ontologies come in, where we're dealing with specific needs. For example, in one of the projects that I did, Semantic DB, this was in the cardiovascular space, dealing with ECG, cath, echo, and surgical procedures. Physiomimy was in the sleep domain, and we were dealing with polysomnography data. And then we have other needs like user interface needs for data entry and etc., measurement units, and even semantic search applications. So do we build custom ontology models for this? Yeah, absolutely. We need custom models for this. But at the same time, we have to remember that interoperability is still a key. So just to summarize this, right? So we have to build an application ontology, the scope of which is, we take the use cases, which explains what the domain is. That gives us a top-down view. We look at the content that is available, the data that is available, and that provides us the bottom-up view. And we look at other needs, like, for example, the user interface needs. And we use some modeling principles like reuse, modularization, and frameworks to do this. So I'll skip this one. This is, the previous one was looking at the clinical use case. I spoke about, from a top-down approach, we can look at what kind of questions that we want answered. From a bottom-up, some term lists like gender, age, and all. And this, between the two of them, it gives us prioritization of how we should approach the modeling. Technically, again, the user interface requirements like visual query and search and things like that, complex definitions, as well as calculations and derived values. So the goal is that we need to build an ontology that is customized to meet the application needs. but reuse existing models and lead to interoperability of data. And this is where ontology patterns come in use. And I'll show you with a few use cases. So the first approach is reuse, right? The goal is we need to reuse existing models and in a custom situation to solve the problem. But the reference models are pretty large. And what we do is we use segmentation algorithms to create custom modules of this. And thus this results in custom models that are useful for our individual situations. But the thing is, the more and more custom models we use, right, it can again lead to fragmentation. And this is where frameworks come into picture, is with the goal to avoid fragmentation. And so for this, we use frameworks like basic formal ontology. This is one of them. There's other ones like Biotop and all. And then there are some principles that are laid out by the OBO Foundry, which like reuse and modularization and frameworks and all that, that we use. The reason why we do this is because models that are common are interoperable, and that interoperability at the model level leads to interoperability of data. So here is an example of the sleep domain ontology that we built using basic formal ontology, Biotop, clinical patient record ontology, ontology for general medical science, NEMO for a neurology ontology, anatomy, and then some special ones for units and drugs. Now, so here is the first use case we look at. This is the from the PhysioMimi project, and so what we built is what we did was we were accessing data from about 6 plus data stores in 4 different states in 4 different institutions, 3 different states, and all of them built individually and separately, right? So there was none of the data schemas were matching, and we needed to build a platform whereby we could query the data across these 4 institutions. So let's see how we did this. So the first thing in the data we looked at were the units, right? We have units, things like age represented in years, height in centimeters, weight in pounds, and hypopnea, which has 30% and seconds, time duration, percentage, and things like that. So we have units both in SI as well as English. So what we did was we took a look at what kind of ontologies were available for units, right? So that was so we had a couple of different models. We could use PATO and measurement units ontology, but our analysis showed that they were not adequate from a coverage point of view, and also they were not expressive enough. So we were forced to build a custom ontology for units. So here you can see we defined both the SI units as well as the English units and the translation between the two. And this is where the formulae came into place. The formulae for things like body mass index, right? So body mass index is weight in kilograms by height in meter square. We also needed to have calculations like kilograms to pounds, inches to centimeters. The problem we had was OWL, or the web ontology language, does not support this. So we overcame this by using formula annotations, where we represented the formula as part of the definition, in the annotation. And from this, we did like foot to inch, units of the same type, kilogram to gram, as well as conversions between English units and SI units. And based on these formulae, we did an inferential expansion so that we could get conversion between any unit to any unit that were related. Now, the second challenge that we had to solve was complex definitions. So here is something, I showed this previously, sleep hypopnea finding, and American Academy of Sleep Medicine has this definition: airflow reduction greater than or equal to 30% of baseline, and at least 10 seconds, and hemoglobin desaturation 4% greater than 4% from baseline. And you can see here is the operational definition in OWL. Now, this is a complex definition, but that wasn't enough, right? So we had to deal with overlapping definitions as well. because we had two different definitions from ASM. Now, like this, we had about 10 different definitions that we found, like hypopnea finding for adults, hypopnea finding for child, and ASM1, ASM2, chat, and all that. And as you can see here, we defined each one of them basically as a simple list under the named hypopnea finding, under the hypopnea finding. And look what happens when you classify it. We infer the hierarchy here. So you can see hypopnea finding adults has these subclasses. The ASM definitions that we previously had now become subclasses of hypopnea finding adult. And you can see the hypopnea finding for SAC has these subclasses, chat and ASM definition 2. So the third thing that we did was use the ontology for user interfaces, where we looked at the different kinds of data, continuous data, categorical data, and Boolean. So continuous data like age is provided as a with this formal definition, right? Using the measurement unit being a year, it's a float with different ranges, right? And then for categorical, similarly, we defined, in this case, if you can see race, we defined all these different races that fall as categorical values. And when we generate the user interface from this, based on these kind of patterns, we draw these kind of widgets. So if you pick age at the time, in this case, we picked age at the time of study, you can see how a widget is drawn, where you can set the age limits. And then for categorical kind of values, you can see you can represent this as checkboxes. Now, going back to this picture, right? So in the user interface, you can see that we have a number of terms that you can see here. So we have a search interface where if you, as you type in the words, letters, the terms start filtering. And these terms came directly from the sleep domain ontology. So how did we connect these? So between these data stores that are there at different institutions, we placed an adapter that provided the mapping layer between the ontology and each one of these data stores, and that provided us. And then using the ontology, we generated this user interface. And for the queries that were described using this user interface, we created an abstract query based on what the user wanted. And that was sent over to each one of these data stores. And using the mapping layer, translated into the individual SQL language, the query ran, and then the results that were brought back were again translated back into the ontology terms and displayed in the user interface. So this was one use case. The second use case is that we did was clinical key, or a semantic search interface, where we were dealing with about 500 plus journals, 700 plus textbooks, which we put through an NLP pipeline for information extraction. And we used EMET, or Elsevier's merged medical taxonomy, to as the core of the ontology model for this NLP pipeline. So this was a project that I did when I was at Elsevier. Now, the results of this NLP pipeline were, was in two forms. One was as a linked data repository, which provided for which we had a Sparkle interface and we could do interactive queries. And the other one was a Mongo database with Apache Solr, and with which we could do a full text search. So this was the product that was developed and deployed into the market, the clinical key search interface. Okay, so with that, I want to conclude this by just going over the role of an ontology in describing reality. So first, It is useful as a formal representation and is computable. It supports reasoning. It forms the basis for an information model. It aids query formulation using Sparkle. And we saw how we can integrate multiple distributed data stores with it. And we can bring together different standard terminologies that provides data integration as well. So I want to acknowledge some of my colleagues with whom I had worked on these projects: Semantic DB project at Cleveland Clinic, the PhysioMimi project at Case Western Reserve University, and the Smart Content project at Elsevier. Thank you. If you have any questions, I can take them.
Awesome, thank you very much. I think we're all giving a virtual round of applause. Very interesting presentation. I am certainly inspired by these ideas because this is actually useful for a multiple of situations, not just healthcare. We had some questions in the chat. I will group Tom Hicks's question with Goldritter's question. I think they're going the same direction. They were curious about the workflow of creating these ontologies, if they are usually done manually by experts or they, when you do these things, you actually use NLP techniques and you extract and group keywords from free text to create these.
So it's a mix of both. So to create good ontologies, it takes a lot of work, right? And it takes, you need to have good domain knowledge to come to represent the definitions well. And it's a very consensus-based approach also. Now, does that mean that we don't use any tools and techniques to help us in this process? No, we do use some NLP tools. Like if you have a body of text that you want to analyze to see what kind of terms that we want to represent in the ontology, you can use some NLP, and you can do like word frequencies, simple things, that tells us what are the most common things that are available there. That will help us from a bottom-up approach that I talked about in understanding what are the important terms, the areas that we want to represent first. Now, are those terms that we want to represent, are they available in any ontology, in any existing ontology? Because if something is, if it's existing in an ontology, we want to be able to reuse it. A number of these ontologies are open source, they're openly available. SNOMED, RxNorm, FMA, and LOINC are some of the models that we use very often in medicine. So, and these are fairly flexible with their licenses, so we can use them. And so if we don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? So if the first thing is search, look to see if something covers it. If it is available, use it. And that is one of the basic principles of the semantic web, or of using ontologies. If it is not available, then we will need to extend a framework or an existing ontology, because we are not creating this in isolation, right? So for example, recently COVID was a good example, right? Till recently, we did not have a term or a disease coming out of, from COVID. So what we did is we extended the infectious disease ontology, and we subclassed SARS virus to represent the coronavirus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and similarly the disease is caused by the coronavirus. So we extended existing terms to cover this new area. Mm-hmm. Does it answer the question?
Very interesting.
Yes, Dr. Arabandi, Tom Hicks. I thank you very much. Nice presentation of introduction to ontologies, but I think of an ontology as a tool that is serves the purpose of achieving some higher goal, and I'm curious to know what your uses were for the ontology once you created it. For instance, in the very first example you gave of the clinical notes, How were you using ontology that you built? Was that the end result? The model was what you wanted, or did you use it to further understand the clinical notes in some way?
So it's the latter, right? You probably don't want, other than a reference ontology which describes a domain, you probably don't want to build ontologies just for the sake of building ontologies, unless you love building ontologies, unless that's what you love.
Right.
For the most part, we build ontologies to solve a real problem. So the first example that I showed with the clinical note, that was with work that I did at the Cleveland Clinic. And so we built a cardiovascular ontology for that. And it was used to interpret the clinical text. And so once we were able to interpret that clinical text, it was represented in the form of an RDF graph. And then the same ontology terms were used as part of the query interface to query the RDF graph. Using
you sort of have in that case, don't you sort of have a chicken egg problem? Because to understand the terms, you need to build the ontology, and then the ontology is necessary to understand the relationships of the terms that you're trying to extract.
It is a little bit of a chicken egg. Fortunately, a lot of the reference ontologies provides us with very, very good domain coverage. And so a lot of terms are already there, existing, and we can leverage those. But as we are parsing the text, we are going to find terms that are not there, and those we definitely need to add. So it's not a one-off process where you look at some text, you develop the ontology, and you're done with it. So as new text comes into play, or as our reality changes, right, you're going to keep evolving the ontology.
Right.
Thank you very much, guys. I know there are more questions, and in the interest of time, let's push this to after the final presentations. When we have open discussion, I'll bring back the questions that were not answered for now. Yep, thank you very much, Sivaram. We will now move on with the presentation by Pier Gherardini with CANDEL, which is a very interesting platform, very cool infrastructure mixing Clojure, R, and Datomic. Pierre, the stage is yours.
Thank you. I'm trying to probably share my screen. Give me a second. All right. Do you guys see it okay?
Yeah, we got it.
Okay. Yeah. So as Santiago was mentioning, this is a real platform for doing biological data science that was built using a combination of Clojure, R, and Datomic. And before I go into the details of the platform, I work at the Parker Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy, so I'm going to give just a 2 seconds introduction to the institute. What is the main work that we're carrying out at the institute, because we really built the platform to power our work, and so it's important to understand what our work is first. So the vision of the institute is really to transform the way that medical research is done, and in order to turn our cancer into curable diseases. And the institute itself is particularly focused on immunotherapy as a treatment modality, which is the idea of using the body's own immune system to attack cancer and eliminate cancer. And the PICE model, so I'm going to call it PICE, which is the acronym that we use internally, and actually in our logo as well. So when I say PICE, I mean the Parker Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy. So the PICE model is really built around collaboration, and the institute was born as an alliance between some of the major cancer centers in the nation that you can see in this slide, and some of the major really leading researchers in these fields. And there is a central office in San Francisco, which is where I work, and where we have an informatics team that, as part of this charge, is taking data from all these different sites, and both from clinical studies as well as laboratory studies and laboratory research that happen on all these sites, and trying to maximize the amount of information that we can extract from this data set in order to advance the field of cancer immunotherapy in general. So as I say, data is really the fuel that powers everything that we do. And in our research, what we're really trying to go is to go from a bench discovery, so something that one of investigators has discovered in one of their labs, maybe in an animal model, move that to the bedside, so translate this into a clinical trial that can be used to test this therapy in actual human patients, and then eventually, if the clinical trial is successful, move these therapies to the market, which is the way that commercialization is really the way that medicine go out in the general population. Besides a clinical trial, that's a very limited, obviously, population just for testing. And as part of this, sometimes we also want to go the opposite. So we want to go from bedside to bench. So we make an observation in a patient. We discover, for instance, that patients that don't respond to a certain therapy have a very high level of expression of a given gene, and so we want to go back to the bench and try to figure out experiments that can explain this observation that we're making in patients. And so in all of this, we use data extensively, both molecular data from our patient sample as well as clinical data, and really CANDEL is the engine that uses all this data to power all this work, and so it's really the core data infrastructure that is central to the work that we do at the Institute. So I've been, up to now, I've been speaking generically about data and wanting to integrate data and use data, but what is the data, does it actually looks in practice in our specific example? So we are running a number of studies as an institute, that's a number of clinical trials, and during these clinical trials, we collect both tumor tissue from patients as well as blood. So we get biopsies and we get blood draws from these patients, and then we use a large suite collection of different molecular assays on these samples to get molecular measurements. So, for instance, on the tumor, we can do whole exome sequencing and figure out all the mutations that are in the tumor, or we can do multi-parameter imaging and trying to see the immune cells and the tumor cells and the relationship between the immune cells and the tumor cell in the impact tissue. Or we can do RNA sequencing, which is essentially measuring the expression of different genes in the tumor. And similarly, on the blood, we can measure different type of molecules that are in the serum, different types of proteins that are in the serum that are important for the working of the immune system, as well as we can profile all the immune cells that are in the blood, and know in these patients how many cells of one type there are and how many cells of the other type there are, and also what's the activity of all these different cells in the blood and the tumor. And then, so all of this generates a large stream of molecular data, so molecular information about what's going on in the cells and the genes of this patient. And then we really marry that with the clinical information that we get from our studies, which are more like the thing that the previous speaker was talking about, which are information such as what is the type of cancer that this patient has, what other comorbidities this patient is experiencing, what drug treatments he received, what was the response, how long did he live, how long did it pass before the disease recurred in the case of cancer, etc. So all this type of clinical information, once again, very similar to what the previous speaker was talking about. And so our job, and the job of this black, actually gray box here, is to bring these two together and trying to figure out if there is anything in the molecular data that predicts any of these clinical features. Right? So for instance, we might discover that patients that don't respond to a certain therapy have a very high expression of a given gene, or maybe they have a very low abundance of a given cell type in their blood, and so on and so forth. And the idea of being able to make these discoveries is twofold. So first of all, we want to be able to give treatments to patients that work. And so when a patient comes at the door, if we do a molecular test and we see that a certain treatment is not going to work on this patient, we don't want to give it to him, and vice versa. If we have a library of treatment to choose for, we want to make sure that we give them the treatment that's appropriate for the molecular profile. So that's one reason. The other reason is to further advance the field of clinical research, right? Because if we discover that the patients that don't respond to this therapy, they all have a very high expression of gene X, then maybe the next step could be trying to figure out if we can develop a molecule that targets gene X, and so can be combined with existing treatment to also address the needs of this specific patient population where the previous treatment wasn't working, right? So the way that this will proceed is by making all of these observations in patients and then using this observation to sort of further advance clinical practice. Because in every clinical study, there is always some subset of patients for which the treatment works and some subset of patients for which the treatment doesn't work. And so the job is really teasing the two apart using the molecular data we collect. So what does a typical data set look like? And this is very important because this is really the basis of the reason why we built the system the way that we built it and the users of the system. So typically we have a kind of like a small number of subjects in a study. So maybe let's say 50 to 100 subjects top. And for each one of these subjects, we have several, you can think of it as a tables or spreadsheet of molecular measurement that represents the results of one of these assays that we carried out on this subject. So for instance, the gene expression assay, right? So in the case of gene expression assay, we get a big table that contains expression of 20,000 different genes in the samples from this specific patient. And we have the similar thing for all the assays that we run. So we will have a big table for our gene expression assay. We will have a big table for our genome sequencing assay, a big table for our imaging assay, et cetera. So very rich data set, but on a relatively small number of patients because we're talking about 50 patients, we're not talking about 10,000 patients. So the other feature of this data is it's very deeply interrelated. Because at the end of the day, when we do these molecular measurements, we're measuring a lot of things that are related to each other. So when we measure the abundance of proteins in the blood, these proteins regulate the activities of the cells that we're also measuring in the blood, right? And when we measure the composition of the number of immune cells into a tumor, well, these immune cells come from the blood in the first place, so they migrate from the blood to the tumor. And so all of these different measures that we're measuring are really kind of like looking at the same biological system, the same human biological system, just from a lot of different angles. And so this data is very deeply interconnected and interrelated. And one of the other important feature of this data is it's typically sparse. So because these are very sick patients that we're getting these samples from, sometimes it won't be possible to have a tissue biopsies, and sometimes somebody was scheduled to get a blood draw on a given day, but he had to skip that blood draw, and so we're not going to have that sample for that patient. So the data is a little bit of a Swiss cheese of what we can get from these very sick patients, and very often is not complete. Actually, it's never complete, basically. So the thing that we like to say is this is not really big data, but it's deep data. So it's not big data because it's not a ton of data. I mean, this is not like Facebook level big data on billions of users and hundreds of thousands of clicks every day. But it's a much smaller data set, but it's very deep because we're collecting a lot of different features on these data sets, on these patients. So what we typically want to do with this data, this is something that I've already mentioned before, so I'm going to go quickly to this slide. But as I said, identify specific subset of patients to figure out if they're going to benefit from the therapy or if they're not going to benefit from the therapy, for instance. Then another thing we want to do is determine if a certain observation has been made before, right? Because we are running lots of studies and other people in the field are running lots of these studies, and so when we see that gene X is overexpressed in the people that do not respond to the therapy, we want to be able to see, has this thing ever been seen in another data set? So there is a component of sort of meta-analysis and going back to the existing data and querying for specific observations. And then, last but not least, we want to use all of these to build, as I said, predictive models that give us insight into the mechanism of action of therapy, right? We want to see if gene X is important for the patients that do not respond to this therapy, what is the biological mechanism that underlies this importance and the reason why gene X is expressed. So we have a team at the Parker Institute that basically is doing all this kind of work for the studies that we're running as an institute. So we as an institute sponsor a number of clinical trials, we collect all this data set, we bring it in-house, and then there is a team, the informatics team, of which I'm a member, obviously, that is tasked with doing all the work that is developed now. And so in order to facilitate and really power our work, we created this platform that we call CANDEL, that stands for Cancer Data and Evidence Library. And it's really a platform for biological data science in general that supports a lot of different data types. And I'm going to talk more about that in the next of the presentation, obviously, in the subsequent slide. So the platform is really, we can conceptualize it as it is in 3 steps. So we start with raw data. So we get, big, massive data files from our sequencing vendor, from our imaging vendors, etc. So this is raw binary files that we need to associate with whatever sample they came from. And at this point, this association is very much unstructured. So you can think of this as almost like an object database. We have all these objects with associated metadata that's completely unstructured. It's just what we get from a vendor. And this raw data goes into a phase that we call primary analysis, which is where we transform it in a much more compact set of useful features. Like, for instance, to give you an example, when you do genome sequencing, the files that you get from the machine are tens of gigabytes files that contain all the raw experimental information. But then these tens of gigabytes files, they get summarized down to a very small spreadsheet of maybe a few hundred K that contains all the variants that are in a specific sample, right? So there is a step here where the data is taken from raw into a set of features that are much more distilled down in size. And once again, this feature would be things as, what is the abundance of a specific protein in the blood, or what is the proportion of cells of a given type in the blood, or what mutation does this patient have, et cetera, et cetera. And so from then, all this data, all this feature then go into this CANDEL database, which is a highly structured database, and it's really the basis that we use for doing all the subsequent data science work. So in trying to answer all the questions I was talking about before, we have all the data in the CANDEL database, and then we pull the data out of the database, and we do machine learning and exploratory statistics on this data. So the rest of this presentation, and even though we are using Clojure and R and Datomic across this entire infrastructure, the rest of this presentation is really going to be mostly focused on this last piece here, the CANDEL database, and how we built it, and how we use it, and how it's organized. So as I said, this database is really a platform for biological data science, and the core idea is to really break down the silos between different types of molecular and clinical data. So as I said, up to now, we get a very broad variety of data sets, and we want them to have them all in a single place so that we can do queries and interrogation that really navigate this data very freely and without impediment in silos. So breaking down barriers, putting everything together was a major design goal of this project. Another very important thing that has to do with the efficiency with which our team can work on the data was really enabling the whole team to make sure that they're working on the same data. So this is like a data versioning problem, right? We have 5 different data scientists that are working on a specific trial. We don't want all of them to have copies of spreadsheets on their computer, and then you're never sure that they're really working on the actual same version of the data. We want to have a centralized repository where all the data is properly versioned, and so everybody that accesses it can be 100% confident they're looking at the same data. The other thing that was really important about, that's still related to the efficiency of the team, is this idea of making analysis code reusable across projects, right? So what happens typically when this work is done in an academic environment where this sort of infrastructure does not exist is that somebody will have a spreadsheet on his laptop for a given project. He will write a whole script that does a whole complicated analysis. And then the next project comes along, and now the files are named completely different. The columns in the spreadsheets are named completely different. And so the code doesn't work anymore because it's been complected. The shape of the code is an amalgamation of what analysis has been done with also the specific way that the data was organized in that specific project. Instead, by having a consistent organization, a consistent data interface across all of our projects, now the code that we write is really reusable, because if I write a script to do a certain analysis on a given study, when I move to a different study, I know that the data is always in the same shape, because the shape of the data is dictated by the data model of the database, and so my code becomes much more usable across projects and across team members. And last but not least was this idea of which really leverages Datomic, for those of you that are familiar with it, which is really keep a history of the data to make sure that we are always able to reproduce our results, right? So we want to be able, if 2 years from now, somebody comes along and says, oh, I want to reproduce the same plot that you produced 2 years ago, we want to be able to do what I just described. That really requires a system for data versioning that is very granular, because otherwise, there will be no way for me to go back to the state of the data 2 years ago and be able to do this if I didn't have a specific system for it. So in answering all of this, let's say, use case and needs, our approach was really to leverage Clojure and Datomic unique, data modeling and processing primitives upstream of standard data science tools. So what we're doing here is not replacing the whole data science stack with Clojure and Datomic. It's leveraging Clojure and Datomic for an area that we think it's very well suited for, that has to do with data regularization, data processing, while at the same time building a bridge for the standard data science workflow, which in our field, which is that of computational biology, means working in R. Okay, so we're not trying to use Clojure and Datomic for everything. We're using Clojure and Datomic for what we think is really good at, and then we're building a bridge to R for all these the scenarios where R is actually a better suited environment. So why we choose Datomic specifically is for a number of reasons. One, and I think one of the most important one, is that the schema is malleable to change. So the problem of biology is that it's an exceedingly complicated field, and also it's continuously evolving. So if you use a database technology which is very inflexible, where you have to get basically the schema right at the get-go, and then you're stuck with it because it's very hard to change, you are really in for some trouble, because you're never ever going to be able to anticipate what if the data is going to look like 2 years from now, let alone 20 years from now. So having a schema that was malleable to change was extremely important, and one of the main reasons why we choose Datomic. The other one was this idea that Datomic, and I'm going to talk about this in a second for those of you that are not super familiar with Datomic itself, but Datomic's really treats time as a first-class concept, which is very important for analytical reproducibility. So it has this concept of the history of the data and being able to access the whole history of the data, which is very important for the reproducibility goal that I mentioned in the previous slide. The last, another important one is performance, obviously. So the performance that we get from the system is absolutely great for the kind of work that we're doing. And the last two are more technical aspects. While one has to do with the expressive of the query language. So the query language at Datomic is actually it's very simple but very expressive. I don't have time to go into it, but if you're not familiar with it, I will suggest all you look into it, because it's very simple and very elegant, but at the same time very powerful. And it's called Datalog. It's really a derivative of Prolog. And last but not least, the economics of the API. I mean, working with the Datomic API is really nice, and that was a huge help for dev velocity. So the basics of the Datomic, I have a slide here just to give you the basics of the Datomic information model for those of you that are not familiar. And actually, the previous talk was the perfect background to all of this, because Datomic is really based on a lot of the same concept that the previous speaker talked about. So everything in Datomic is modeled as datums, which are really tuples. Okay, and each datum or each tuple represents a single fact about an entity, similar to what happens with RDF, which is exactly the stuff that the speaker was talking about. And so this table here represents a collection of tuples or datums that to show you a little bit the structure. So we have an entity ID that is used to identify entity, and especially to identify tuples that refer to the same entity. Then we have an attribute that represents what we are saying about this specific entity, and then a value for this attribute. So for instance, the first tuple tells me that the entity 123 is a subject with ID 1235X. And then the same entity is a subject that has disease, head and neck cancer. And then the same entity has been subjected to a therapy called 789. So now 789 would be the ID of another entity in the system. And so the entity 789 in this other entity, which is a therapy with the name Keytruda. Okay, so the way that is, and this is the way that you model relationship between entities in Datomic, by having by having attributes that represent the value, whose value represents the ID of another entity, and so you can create a graph essentially of all the different entities. So it's important to note here that the attributes come from a schema. So the attributes cannot be anything. The attributes have to be defined in a schema, but it's very easy. If you want to add another attribute, you just add it to the schema and you can use it from now on without having to modify the existing data. And the other thing that's important is that attribute can be namespace here, as you can see, and that allows you to sort of define a concept, a little bit of entity. So even though Datomic doesn't have a concept of entity per se, so there isn't such thing as a subject entity or a therapy entity, we can model the same thing using attribute namespaces essentially. And so last but not least, as I was saying, the time is actually a first-class concept in Datomic. So the actual table in the database looks something more like this, which is there are two additional fields that are added, which represent the time that this fact was inserted in the database, and also whether this Boolean, whether this was an assertion of a retraction for a fact. And these two different things basically allow you to have the full history of the database. Okay, so you can always go back and say, hey, I want to do a query of this database as it was 2 years ago, and that will return me exactly the same result that I got 2 years ago. And because of the way that time is treated by the Datomic system. So we get all of this history for free by using Datomic, just by extending this to, just by the fact that Datomic extends this notion of RTF tuple with this additional time and assertion, attribute. Okay, so this is the core of the system. So most of our work as developers has been, how to get data into, how to facilitate getting data into the system and how to facilitate using data. So getting data out of the system and using it. So in the next few slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about how do we the system will be for getting data into Datomic. And the reason why we built a specific thing here, a specific system, a specific infrastructure, is because we want our data scientists to be able to import data into this database, right? So our data scientists don't know Clojure, don't know Datomic, don't know any of the internals of the database, but still they need to be able to take an existing data set and put it into the system. And so in order to facilitate this, we developed this tool that we call PRET, that stands for Programmable ETL, and it's really a configurable ETL for getting data into Datomic. So I'm going to walk you through this busy slide here in a few minutes. So basically, we start from source data, and you can imagine this as a collection of TSV files, okay, or CSV or a spreadsheet or whatever. And this would be, a typical spreadsheet. So what the user needs to do here, the only thing that the user needs to do to import this into Datomic is to write a configuration file, which is an idem file that specifies how essentially the columns and the files in this data set maps to the attribute in the schema. So for instance, what this very little snippet here is telling me is that the barcode column matches to the database attribute sample ID, and that the participant column in this file maps to the subject attribute in the schema, right? So this is basically establishing a connection between the column headers and the attributes in the schema. In this specific example, obviously there is a little bit more than that because we also have reference between the different files, etc. But this should be enough to provide you a flavor of what this is. So the user writes a configuration file, doesn't write any code, it just writes this configuration file, and then the tool that we wrote, PRET, which is a Clojure command line tool, takes the source data, the configuration file, and the knowledge of the Datomic schema and meta model, which is some additional things that we built into the Datomic schema. But let's say the Datomic schema for now. So it takes all of these things and then prepares transaction data that can really be imported into the database. So then in a subsequent command, the transact command, PRET will take all of this transaction data and put it into a database. So taking care of like database timeout, transaction retries, blah, 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 all of that stuff. So the mechanic of putting the data from a set of flat files into a database. And then the last step is performing validation, which is very important. And so validation includes like validation of scalar attributes, like a percentage can only be a positive number, for instance. Then referential integrity, so making sure that all references are correct. So if I have a measurement that targets a specific sample with the sample barcode 1 to 3, then I need in my sample files, I need to have defined sample 1 to 3 for this reference to be valid. And also stuff that has to do with attribute composition. So which combinations of attributes are valid for specific entities. So this step is really important because the data that the process of putting the data into the database really does a ton of QC and standardization of the data, which is very important. And for instance, as part of this import process, we standardize a lot of the data using existing ontologies. So there are ontologies that describe the name of different genes, the name of different proteins, the name of different drugs, et cetera, et cetera. And as part of this import and validation process, we make sure that everything that needs to be validated onto an ontology has been actually validated on the right ontology and mapped to the right ontology. So I'm gonna maybe skip this because I don't want to go over time, and that's not really that important. So besides this system, we also built essentially a system to do a branch and merge workflow for data, right? Because as I said before, we want user to be able to import their own data set, but at the same time, we don't want user to just start dumping stuff into the production database. And so we built a system whereby user can request a copy of the master database in order to work on the import of the specific data set. So on this branch database, they're free to mess it up, or it doesn't matter if they import broken data, or in the process of iterating over this data set, they're going to import broken data multiple times. It doesn't really matter because it's happening on a copy of the database. And then there's a system whereby we can put the data back on master, sort of like a commit back on master pending administrator approval. And so these commits to master can be two things. Can be either entirely new data sets, or it can also be diff updates of existing data sets that are already in the system. So maybe this data set A was already, an old version of the data set was already in the system, but somebody has come up with an updated version in the data set. So where the process becomes that of determining what are the differences between the new version and the old versions in the database, and making sure that we reconcile all these differences. So we like to think of this as I said, as like a branch and merge workflow for data. So then, the data is all in there. Now we have to, we're building all of this for data scientists to use. So we have to meet them where they live, and the data scientists, at least in our team, and I would say in the majority of computational biology, they live in R. So we built a lot of infrastructure to make sure that the data can seamlessly go from the way it is in Datomic to a native R object that can be used for downstream analysis. So we accept queries obviously over the wire, and the query sources can be either an R library, which is what our user use. So our user issue query through an R library, or also a visual query building environment that I think has been, it's called Enflame, and I think has been presented by Mike Travers from our team in a previous meetup. And then the data is really, these queries are serialized to JSON. And so we have a data.json parser on the other end that accepts the query and transform it from JSON into something that Datomic can understand. And then also a system to automatically improve queries. I'm not really going to talk about these two aspects today, because first of all, we talked about it before, but also I want to focus on the R functionality, which is more important for the data science part. So as I say, data log queries can be issued from R. And so we essentially wrote a DSL in R that mirrors the way that queries look in Clojure, right? So this is the way that you would do a Datomic query in Clojure. This is an example from the Music Brains database. This Clojure query will look this way in R. So as you can see, it's basically a very simple, substitution of certain syntactic element, but it's basically it looks the same way. And so we have this explains the transformation that we had to do. We've been going from the Clojure syntax to the R syntax, but it's really a one-to-one mapping. And I'm going to explain in a second why we had to do it. So basically, you can write a query like this in R, looking very similar to Clojure, and then when you get in R is a native R object that you can use with all the functionality that exists in R. So you want to use R for plotting, you issue a query like this, you get back in your R session, you get back a native R object, and then you use it for downstream plotting as you would with any other native R object. But the other interesting thing is that data logging queries in R are data exactly the same way that they are in Clojure. This really enables composition and programmatic composition of queries, right? So this is something that allows us as developers to really build our queries that are built programmatically. So for instance, to give an example here, we have a situation where we have an existing query which we're calling Q here, and we want to add a bunch of different clauses to this query based on a given parameter in input, right? And so we have this function here, cQuery, that allows to take an existing query and to add additional clauses to it, and these clauses are selected based on some other logic. And so this is very useful, very useful because a very useful consequence of the fact that our queries are data structured the same way that they are in Clojure. It would be something that would be much more complicated to do if queries were instead strings and you had to do a ton of string interpolation, right? We can instead manipulate queries as data. So this DSL really takes advantage of R's Lisp origin. So I don't know how familiar you guys are with R, but R was really a Lisp initially. And it takes advantage of the fact that symbols and expression can really be captured before evaluation and manipulated. One limitation is that you're still constrained by the fact that the expression need to be valid R syntax. And so that's the reason why we had to do some transformation of the syntax from Clojure to R, because you still need to end up with valid R syntax. The pool syntax that you have in Datomic is also available. So the same way that you can do a pool query in Datomic, you can do a pool query with our library with this syntax transformation. So at the end of the day, what we have here is really what I've given you a very quick tour of is really, we call it the CANDEL universe, because it's a whole set of packages and tools that revolve around this CANDEL database. So the database itself is built in Datomic. We have this spread package that I was saying is the programmable ETL pipeline that's written in Clojure, and that uses talks also to an additional system that's called Candelabra that contains all the machinery for doing the branch and merge workflow and access control, as I said before. So this is the way that data gets into the system, and then data gets out of the system by having, there's this Clojure server called Lantern, which is basically accepts the queries over the wire and returns the queries over the wire. And then we have a bunch of our packages that we've built that essentially talk to this Lantern system and allows the user, not only the user to write queries in R and the way that I was describing up to now, but also contain a lot of pre-canned functionality, right? Because at the end of the day, a lot of the time our users don't even write queries. They just say, give me all the gene. We have a function, a pre-baked function, a pre-baked query in our library that says, give me all the gene expression measurements for this data set. So the user actually just called that. And so it's exposed to them as an R library. They get the data back and then they do whatever analysis they want. And on top of that, we've also built a lot of, we're starting to build a lot of tools for doing interactive data exploration and visualization, right? So you can build dashboards and widgets that talk to the database, and so allow somebody that doesn't know R, but knows how to click around to generate plots and visualization from the same system using the same R and Clojure infrastructure all the way down. So some elements of some general purpose elements of this system we have open source, and so if you go on our GitHub, you can see some of these things, and get a feeling for this idea yourselves. So last slides is acknowledgement. So really want to acknowledge Lacey Kitch from our team and Ben Campos, which have been obviously partner in building all the system up and absolutely essential contributors. And then as well as in particular George Kirsten from the Cognitive team, which has also been a huge help in the system. And with that, I'm only 6 minutes over time, so I'll take questions, and thank you for listening.
Awesome, thank you very much. This is really a cool topic. I was just talking with Danielle before about something similar. I really like this project, and again, virtual clapping to you. We had lots of activity in the chat. Mm-hmm. I think some of the questions kind of solved themselves, but Jordan is asking if it was straightforward for the users living and working with R to learn this Datomic DSL.
So if you're talking about the query language, I mean, it's not, yes, if you're talking about this, yes, it wasn't too complicated, but I must say that the reality is that we've built already so much functionality that our users very rarely go down to the level of writing custom queries. So a lot of the time, so I'm showing you what is like the nuts and bolts of how this thing works, but the reality is that most of the time users just use the functionality that were built on top already. But yeah, I mean, we had users picking this up. I would say that the probably what users have had to more learning to do was learning how to use Pret. But you know, I think this is still it's still less than they would have to learn if we had to learn how to do Clojure and Datomic to do transactions and everything. So you know, one thing that I like about this system is that we have had and we've literally had high schoolers join our team. And in a couple of weeks, as interns during the summer, in a couple of weeks, they were able to use the system to import data. Because the only thing that you really need to understand here is the data and how it maps to the schema. You don't need to understand the Datomic's internal.
Well, yeah, that's really cool to hear. I mean, if you can get to that level of quick activity and productivity, even with high school kids, then really speaks to both the quality of Datomic and then the interface with R. This is really interesting. I was curious because there was some conversations about this in the chat. Mm-hmm. If you could comment on the importance of reproducibility in this system. I feel it's something that I personally, for example, have to explain to the developers that work with me that are not data scientists. And I feel it's a very core principle of data science in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yes, I can certainly explain that. So you know, if you do a little bit of Google searching, you would see people decrying the crisis of reproducibility in science, right? So in general, in science, there is this problem in biological sciences, especially of getting reproducible results. So being able to, you know, I do an analysis, then I give it the data of somebody else, and he's able to do the same analysis, he or she is able to do the same analysis. So this whole reproducibility problem as a whole host of reasons, so some of which are solvable in software and some of which are not solvable in software. What we wanted here was to at least try the stuff that's under our control, so the stuff that's solvable in software, to solve it as much as possible, right? And so obviously, when you have a piece of data analysis, in order to have a reproducible result, you need to have, you know, the code need to be versioned, obviously, but we have Git for that, so that's very easy. Then the environment in which the code is run needs to be versioned, and you can use Docker for that. So it's very easy to have a reproducible environment. The piece that really was missing, at least for us, was having reproducible data. So being able to know for a fact that the data has not changed. It was 2 years ago. And so that's where our system comes in. And the reason why you want to do this is because, you know, this data is exceedingly complicated and errors are made all the time in the analysis. And so it's very important both for, you know, for auditing, for being able to answer you know, questions from other people in the field, that you are always able to at least you know, get the same result. Maybe it was the wrong result in the first place, but at least you can get the same result. And so, you know, it happens all the time that, you know, maybe somebody reads your paper and will see a result and won't be able to you know, will download your data and won't be able to reproduce the same thing, right? So we want to at least be in the position where we can guarantee that whatever went into the publication, whatever was in the figure, we can reproduce it exactly. Now, obviously, this doesn't guarantee that that result is correct, because there could be still bugs in the code or whatever. The analysis code could be incorrect, but having it be reproducible is the first step, at least to, you know, to being able to start from a common understanding of where things are.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you very much. There was also a question by Jesus regarding this branch and merge system. Mm-hmm. Because every time you have this type of system, you can have conflicts when you try to merge everything together. Yeah. Could you comment on that? Yeah.
So the reason why we built this system was really the fact that when you do this, when you use Pret to do this imports, obviously you import the data the first time and you realize that you made a mistake on your configuration file, or the data is wrong in some way, so you need to fix it before you can import it, right? So the idea, it was impossible, the idea of merging directly, trying to go directly from a user to production would have been crazy, because we would end up with a ton of junk in the production database as user iterate to this process, right? So the reason why we built it was really allowing users iteration. That doesn't mean, there is still, and I put it here in this diagram, an admin approval process, right? So when it's a new data set that's coming in, a user, an admin is essentially looking at it and making sure that the user has done the right thing, and then it gets merged. The diff updates, actually, we built a custom system based on Datomic, which basically, if the case is that A is already in the database, but we have an updated version of A, we have built a system that basically transfers all the entities in this data set, determines all the differences, and only transact the sets of differences that are necessary to bring the data sets in the same status. So this is actually a very complicated project that we just recently finished. And in order for this to be possible, we really had to make sure that there's lots that goes into making this possible. But like one important thing is that every single entity in the database needs to have a unique domain-based identifier, so not just a DB identifier, but really a domain-based identifier, so that you can able to say, is this gene expression measurement in the old version of the data set the same as the gene expression measurement in the new version of the data set, right? So actually, this diffing of existing data is a much more complicated problem than just the idea of importing a whole new data set in production, which is really about an admin approving and then triggering a series of processes in the cloud that basically take all the data import in the production. This is semantically this was a much more complicated endeavor to calculate all these differences and making sure that it's done in a correct way, but this is done automatically.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Very interesting. There was also a question, I guess, that both you and Sivaram can talk about. There was some discussion regarding the use of ontologies in hierarchies, like we saw initially, how Sivaram explained. Then it seems that in CANDEL, the ontologies end up being more like a graph or flatter. And there was some discussion that there's some challenges in using hierarchical ontologies. And I think this discussion is interesting. I would like to hear from both of you. I guess first, why is it a challenge and what we can do about it?
Yeah, I mean, I can give a little quick perspective from the CANDEL side, and then I'll be curious to hear Sivaram's perspective. So, we are in ontologies. There's a big difference between an ontology and a control vocabulary. So where a control vocabulary is really a list of terms that are valid, an ontology is all this hierarchical relationship between the concepts. We are using more ontologies as a list of control vocabulary, so making sure that the terminology is consistent. And you're right, we're not using. We very much strive to use flat vocabularies, and the main reason for this is that for our specific use case, this process of standardization mapping to ontology has to be done by data scientists that don't have the patience or the willingness to learn all the intricacies of these ontologies. Like, so for instance, I'll make a very simple example in terms of disease type. So obviously we want the disease type to be a standardized control vocabulary. So lung cancer should always be lung cancer. Okay, so that's the control vocabulary aspect of it. But at the same time, some of the ontologies that are used in the biomedical field are really elaborate in terms of placing this lung cancer concept in a very complicated tree, as Sivaram was explaining, a very complicated trees and taxonomy of classification of cancer. We decided not to use that and to prefer another ontology that's a bit more rough and less sophisticated, but has the property of being essentially a flat control vocabulary, because we really, in order to be able to do this mapping precisely, you need to really be a specialist in these ontologies, and our scientists, our data scientists are definitely not specialists, and they're not gonna become anytime soon.
Yeah, so I agree with what Federico said. Using the hierarchies, the taxonomy aspect of the ontology fairly advanced use of the ontology. For the most part, the most common use is to flatten the structure of the ontology and use it as lists or multiple lists, which moves more towards what you are saying, Federico, as control vocabularies. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean that it's a wrong way. It's an incorrect way of using an ontology. It is one way in which an ontology can be used, right? The same labels and the same words and terms that you're using, that you're getting from the ontology, once you have mapped them into your data, and you can still make use of the structure, the ontology structure, both the hierarchy as well as the other relationships that actually make it and turn it into a rich web of a rich graph. You can use that for querying and for reasoning, and for doing a lot of for generating new information that was previously not or not asserted in the data itself, right? So a simple example of something like that would be, in your data set, if you had a cancer that was labeled as oral cancer, right? And you have other cancers which are labeled as, say, nasal cancer or cancer of the ear, and another one like ear cancer. But if you're going to now start querying, hey, I want to find out all patients with head and neck cancers, right? The word head and neck doesn't appear in any one of these data points that you've just stored, right? One says oral cancer, another says nasal cancer, another says ear. So this is where the power of an ontology comes in, where even though your data is at the level of the more granular terms, you can pull back up and do a subsumption query where you can query for all the subclasses of what a head and neck cancer is. And that's where you take the taxonomy, the hierarchy structure, and do that query and bring back all the results that match oral cancer and all these, because all of them fall under head and neck cancer. That's one way of doing it. It sounds very simple, but I think, as probably Federico knows, it's not the simplest of things to do. Yeah. And this is something that you can do in a triple store like Virtuoso or BlazeGraph or Allegrograph, which are pure RDF triple stores, semantic web triple stores. Datomic does not support this kind of reasoning. Mm-hmm. One of the areas that I have worked with previously is how do you represent this kind of ontological structure into a Datomic schema and be able to develop custom algorithms so that you can do this kind of reasoning in Datomic. Because if you look at, I think I didn't mention it, and I think Federico also didn't mention it, the Sparkle language is actually very, very close to Datalog. Mm-hmm. The RDF triple structure is very similar to the EAV data structure in Datomic. And when I met Rich Hickey, I asked him about this because I'm coming from a semantic web background, and when I first encountered Clojure and then Datomic and met Rich Hickey at one of the Clojure conferences, I asked him about it, and he said yes, Clojure and Datomic borrows a lot from the semantic web space. And so you can see a lot of that thought process that went into developing Datomic.
Tom Hicks, you had an interesting comment. Would you like to elaborate?
Which particular one?
You say that if the fact store covers a semantic field well enough, is large enough or diverse enough?
Oh, Ben, I think this was in reaction to Ben's comment that he could sort of infer the relationships from the fact store, and I was a little skeptical. I suppose if the fact store is large enough or diverse enough, you could do that, but to cover the semantic field that you're trying to extract. But if you had, say, a very narrow set of relationships, I'm not sure whether that would be sufficient to really get back to a real ontology. Do you agree, or?
So in a very small space, if it's a small problem that you're dealing with, I would definitely say that, if you're using an ontology, that would be an overkill. It's like saying, if you want to put if you want to dig a small hole to plant a small planter, right? You don't want to get a big 10-ton truck digger to dig that hole, right? So you have to use the right tools for the right purposes. So if you have a very small, well-defined space, then writing your own relation, how you want to find relations within them or what you want to infer from it is probably going to be just as easy as trying to, or maybe easier than trying to use an ontology, or for that matter, something like Datomic for it. It's a non-trivial process.
So the trade-offs on your controlled vocabularies are what? Perhaps you could speak to that a little more. I'm assuming something like you can't easily identify hierarchical things like classes and superclasses as easily if you just have a list of controlled items. Yes?
I mean, what are the trade-offs? I didn't quite follow that.
Well, so you said you're using controlled vocabularies, which are really just lists. I assume that what you mean is they're sets of items, so that you identify head and neck cancer as being in the same set as some other term related to throat cancer or something like this. So you're not using a hierarchical ontology here.
Yeah.
So what are the trade-offs for doing that?
So yeah. So the thing about controlled vocabularies is that you can pretty much put anything in there, right? It's not a pure taxonomic structure. Now, what does a hierarchy mean in terms of taxonomic structure, or in terms of an ontology, right? So when you say A is a subclass of B, what does that mean? So for example, you say a dog is a subclass of animal. The class dog, right, is a subclass of the class animal. What does that mean? What it means is that every instance of a dog is an instance of an animal, and there is no instance of a dog that is not an instance of there's no instance of dog that is not an instance of animal. It has got that kind of connotation to it, formalism associated with it. So when you create an ontology, when you create a hierarchy in an ontology, this is the kind of discipline that you are following. But when you look at controlled vocabularies, and I'll give you an example from ICD-9 codes, right? ICD-9 code is the diagnostic codes that are used in medicine. And if you go to ICD-9 and hypertension area, right, you will see hypertension, which is a disease, but you'll also see something like hypertension with heart disease, hypertension with chronic kidney disease. Okay, so if you think of this as from a hierarchical point of view, you're saying that hypertension with kidney disease, so there are two diseases there, hypertension and kidney disease, is a hypertension. And that doesn't make any sense. A kidney disease is not a hypertension.
Yep.
So that's
going
where
across two axes, right?
I'm sorry?
You're going across two axes, right? I mean, you're saying it's a certain disease, but it also is related to another disease. Wouldn't that sort of imply that you would want to move to a more general graph structure where you could represent more relationships than simple ISA?
Yeah, so the ISA relationship provides the hierarchical structure, right? And along with that, if you were to the example that I gave, right, it was about from pain. Pain says chest pain is a type of pain, and then it has site the chest. So that provides the other kinds of relationships which goes towards enriching this graph. And that's what you're missing out when you use just a control vocabulary. You don't have any of those things.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much to both of you. Since we still have some time until our deadline for the end of the meeting, and there was a list of topics and some questions that we gathered during the RSVP process, I would like to just open the floor. Wonder if someone has any further questions. They may be data science specific. They may be about, someone asked about the state of the data science stack, for example, in Clojure. The floor is yours. Feel free to ask any question to anyone at this point. Yeah, go ahead, Jose. Jesus, sorry.
A pending question to Sivaram. In his architecture, how do you use Clojure?
Okay, so in my, I don't use Clojure for most of my work. I use Clojure more on a personal side for doing most of my own research projects, my own skunkworks kind of a thing. And that's where I've used it all the way from, for building data science pipelines to even web applications, as well as for some, NLP, and more recently in struggling with some machine learning kind of areas. So on the side of semantic web and ontology, I have worked in, I have done some work around being able to use ontologies and ontology schemas and being able to represent them in Datomic. And Crux, I don't know if you've heard of Crux. Crux is the other database which is similar to Datomic. And so that's another one that I've used. And to be able to represent ontologies in as a schema in Datomic, and being able to leverage the hierarchies and other relationships within them.
Yeah, Sivaram, you mentioned you were doing, you did some machine learning and NLP in Clojure. Is that correct?
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the stack? I'm personally very curious about these matters.
With NLP, I have used OpenNLP for the main part. That seems to have pretty decent Clojure support. The other ones that I've come across are like Stanford NLP, and but I haven't used that. And I know that there are other ones where you can come across examples on the net, but I've not found them. I've really struggled to make them work, both for NLP as well as for machine learning.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Leandro, that was Crux, C-R-U-X. It's the database that's similar to Datomic.
Yeah, so it's, I'll put it in the chat.
I was wondering for the CANDEL people, I know there's more than one here in the chat still. Is anyone using anything else besides R for doing the actual analytics?
Not in our team, no. We're all using R. But one could imagine, obviously, the same way that we built a system to use R, we can imagine building a system to use Python, even though I think I'm not as familiar with Python, but I don't think that the same level of symbolic manipulation is possible with Python. So the syntax might be a little bit more string-based, but no, in our case, we all use R.
And I'll chime in. Sorry, Federico.
I was just going to say that Lacey and Ben are in the audience, as you guys have seen. So.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Lacey. I also work at the Parker Institute and work on CANDEL. Been chatting with some of you. I'll also say that the large reason that we use R for all of our data science and analytics is because of the extensive library of computational biology tools that exist in R. So anytime a new paper comes out with a new method in computational biology, it's always written up first as an R package. So being in R for us is pretty critical to staying able to use the most current methods in the field. So that's why we're in R.
I guess you use bioconductor?
Yep. Yeah, bioconductor, a lot of things. Some people release things not through bioconductor, but yeah.
Cool. There's a question about how CANDEL research is usually published.
What do you mean? Like research that we get, the results that we get from CANDEL?
I guess, yes.
Yeah, I mean, we just, they end up published, I mean, in scientific publication in journals, the same way that they would be in if we weren't using CANDEL. So this is, from the all intents and purposes, this is like an infrastructure of details that it's will be mentioned in the publication maybe, but it's not really most of the time it's not really relevant to this kind of paper that really focus on the results.
Jesus, you had a question?
I have two questions. So the first one is I'm noticing then that Clojure is not the favorite tool for data analysis. So what you as a community know is Clojure in this place? Is it possible to connect to R? I heard before about Python. I know something like you can connect to Python. Obviously, with Clojure, you can use all Java libraries and all there is Erlang, JavaScript. Is there something for R? That's like the same question. No? And the other question is I'm curious about your use case, Sivaram, sorry, of Crocs and the 2 times the stuff they provide.
Sorry, I didn't get the question, Jesus.
Yes, so Crocs has like a 2 axes for time.
Okay.
Right? That's what I understand. This is Datomic is time-based, Crocs is time-based, but they provide like a second line of time. And I was wondering how would somebody take advantage of that? And if for some reason you're using that or you're using it as a Datomic.
I'm using it more closer to what Datomic functionality is providing. I haven't really explored a lot about the time travel aspect that Crux is featuring.
Yeah, I'm playing a bit with Crux, but really on the same page, right? Just using it.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe Daniel, could you comment on R interop with Clojure?
Yeah, there is a Clojure library for calling R from Clojure, and it is called Clojure, and I would love to discuss it. It is still not used in production anywhere as much as I know, but we are working on making it more stable. So let us talk about it.
Good to know. Thank you. Clojure, something like that. No? I didn't understand.
I'll put a link at the chat. Clojure, yeah.
Yeah, I pasted the link.
Yeah, and what about data analysis in general? So how much does need Clojure to be at least considered in that field?
Well, I mean, I can maybe answer this question just from my perspective. So, and Lacey really answered it already. You know, in our field, you know, there's such a mountain of analytical routine already written in R that obviously the idea of writing them in Clojure for us is a non-starter, really, because of the, you know, that's the standard in the field is R. So the approach that we have taken has to do with like using Clojure for all this data processing, and you know, a lot of it is done in an abstract way because it's you know, it doesn't for instance, the tools that we built are all schema agnostic. So they don't have, Pret doesn't know anything about the Datomic schema. The Datomic schema is read as input. So a lot of this computation happens at a pretty high level from a semantic point of view, because it doesn't actually know the semantics of the schema. It interprets the semantics of the schema. And so, for all of this stuff, Clojure has been fantastic. And I don't even know how we would have written this in any other language. But the way we're using it is really confined to a specific problem domain for which we think it's really well suited. And then then we're using R for all the analysis, because once again we wouldn't be, our users are all in R. They're not going to learn to use Clojure. I mean, that's just the reality. But I will also say that, so one thing that's really interesting, so what we're doing is not, it's different from what Daniel was mentioning. So we're not trying to either use like embed R in Clojure or embed Clojure into R, obviously, right? So the system is Clojure, in Clojure and Datomic is a web server, and you could query the web server however you wanted. We happen to be querying in R because we use R. But I guess what Daniel was talking about, and what maybe other people here are hinting about, is actually not slightly, a very different problem, which is having the R interpret talk to the JVM and vice versa, which is really not what we're doing.
Yep. Guys, thank you so much, everyone. We had wonderful discussions. As someone suggested, I am saving the chat. I think we have wonderful information in there, and we'll find a way to share it appropriately. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time today. I hope everyone learned something new. At least I know I did. And I definitely encourage everyone to keep discussions, either contacting the speakers or joining the Clojurians Zulip channel, or either getting in touch with me, Daniel, anyone in the Scicloj community. We are always eager to have more people talking about data science and Clojure, and seeing what you guys are doing out there. Thank you very much, and see you all next time.
Thank you, Santiago. Fantastic moderation. Daniel, as usual, thanks for hosting this. And Federico, loved your talk. Thank you.
Thanks. You too. Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Is it okay to ask, maybe Jesus could talk just for a bit about the Spanish-speaking Clojure project?
Yes, I completely forgot. I'm sorry.
In Berlin.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I was just mentioning, I didn't want to take this time for that. No. But just mentioning, I'm really happy because I've been able to collect a group of people interested in learning Clojure. We created this community called Clojure Hispanic. And we just recently revive it, because it was existing like last year, but like in the last month we are reviving the group, and it's really active now. We are doing inspired by you with this idea of study groups. We just propose it, and we are reading books now about Clojure, and basically I'm here like spying and taking notes about how to manage study groups. But we are like 26 people, and all of us have been doing this all the weeks, doing the classes, and that I think is a good signal. Well, that's it. No? So we are people from Spain, obviously, and all the Americas. I'm from Venezuela. I'm in Canada, but I'm from Venezuela. We have people from Nicaragua, Peru, Argentina, and Spain right now. And it's good to find people speaking my language, where I can do a better level in communications for sharing Clojure knowledge and ideas. Yeah.
Jesus, could you maybe leave a link in the chat so other people can?
Yeah. That would be very
sure.
useful. Really.
I'm going to share the link of the Telegram group right now, and then when we have a domain for the group, but we don't have a content right now. But so that's why I'm going to share only the Telegram group. link. Okay.
Jesus, is there any other group that or community that you are in, like mainly Spanish speaking, but could be also non necessarily Spanish speaking?
Well, I manage I manage a group called Python Venezuela. We do have more content. We are more mature. Years we have the page and everything, and has many more people. That's the other group I'm managing. I'm founder of that thing, and we have a foundation in Venezuela for that. It's big. It's have people from many places, not only Venezuela. I don't know why. It's good. But I'm all in now in Clojure. Like I use. I help with the Python Venezuela group all Fridays. I do something called a consulting hour. I spend 1 hour in Jitsi, one video conference, and people freely come in and ask questions, right? And I just try to help or try to answer the questions about Python. When I get some, or that's an idea, right? If I get some expertise in Clojure, I expect to do the same thing for Clojure on daily. It's one hour a week. I just put the link in the group and no scheduling. I'm just there waiting for them. And then randomly people come in and ask me something about Python, and we try to fix something or explain something. Yeah,
I was asking because I'm from Argentina, and I think it's a very useful initiative because most of the documentation is normally in English, and many people don't speak the language, so it's a huge barrier for them. So yeah, I think it's
well, in Argentina, you must know Python Argentina probably.
Sorry?
Do you know the community Python Argentina?
Yes, I'm not involved in it, but yes, I know.
They are the best example of I think it's the best example of a community in a local language. They did the whole translation in Spanish of all the Python documentation, and everything is in Spanish, and it's wonderful. And we try to, when we created Python Venezuela, we tried to mimic Python Argentina, but we didn't need to do translation. Everything I put links to Python Argentina. I move everybody to Python Argentina when they need to read documentation in Spanish. But we don't have anything like that in Clojure, not even near. No? So that would be the most important, I think, initiative to just have translated content. I know by firsthand how different it is to reading, in Spanish and in English. It's air to heaven, right? So yeah, that would be a good goal if we collect enough energy, I suppose.
Jesus, I think it might be also useful to share this in the Zulip data science channel. You probably will reach more people, and I think you and Leandro are now, you'll probably have a lot more to talk about. Yeah, cool. Then again, thank you very much, everyone. It was awesome. For those that are starting the day, have a nice day. For those that are finishing it, have a nice night. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you and bye.